Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a winter night in the Middle Ages, into a world where darkness arrived early, heat never stayed where you wanted it, and going to bed was not the soft, forgettable end of the day, but the beginning of a small and very private struggle. You can feel it almost at once. The floor underfoot is hard and cold enough to seem alive. The room is dim except for firelight and one weak candle. Somewhere nearby, a shutter knocks faintly in the wind. A draft moves through the chamber in a way that feels deliberate, as though the building itself has learned how to find any patch of exposed skin. You are tired, perhaps after a long day of work or travel or service, or simply the ordinary labor of living in a world that demanded far more from the body than ours does now. And yet, sleep is not waiting for you as comfort. Sleep is something you will have to prepare for. That is the first thing worth understanding. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture the visible things first. Candlelight on wood, thick cloaks, stone walls, tapestries, a fire burning somewhere in the background. The image can feel atmospheric, even beautiful. But beauty from a distance is not the same as comfort from within. To actually live through one of these nights was to know that cold was not merely part of the scenery. It was one of the central facts of existence. It shaped rooms, habits, clothing, architecture, rituals, and the body's own expectations. It entered your hands, your feet, your chest, your sleep, your mood, and your memory. It is tempting to say that medieval people were simply used to it, and in one sense they were. Human beings can get used to almost anything that repeats often enough, but used to it should not be mistaken for unbothered. They still dreaded bitter nights. They still understood the danger of winter. They still recognized the misery of lying down in a room that seemed to give back none of the warmth you brought into it.
A child could feel it. An old man could feel it more. A servant crossing a room before dawn could feel it in the knees, in the fingertips, in the lungs. So could a lord. So could a nun. So could anyone whose body had to survive until morning in a season that treated sleep as exposure. And that is what makes the question so compelling. How did people sleep in the Middle Ages without freezing to death? Not in the exaggerated way we sometimes speak about discomfort today, but literally. How did they create enough warmth, enough shelter, enough temporary mercy to get a human body through the long, cold hours between dusk and sunrise? The answer is not a single clever invention. It is not one dramatic medieval trick hidden from us by time. It is something quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more impressive than that. The answer is that they built warmth in layers. Not only with blankets, though blankets mattered. Not only with fire, though fire mattered too. They built it with wood, fabric, fur, bodies, food, routine, room choice, bed curtains, rushes, shutters, shared space, hot drinks, dogs, servants, prayers, and habit. They built warmth the way one builds a life under pressure, piece by piece, using whatever the world will give. That is also why the story of sleep in the Middle Ages is not really a story about beds alone. It is a story about the body in an unforgiving environment. Think for a moment about what cold does to a body that is trying to rest. It tightens the muscles before sleep has even begun. It keeps the feet alert with discomfort. It makes the nose sting and the hands clumsy. It turns undressing into an act of courage. It makes stillness harder, because stillness invites the chill deeper in.
And if you are old or underfed or ill, it becomes more than discomfort. It becomes a threat. Sleep, which should restore you, starts to resemble a negotiation. How many layers? How close to the fire? Which room? Who beside you? What under you?
What around you? What can be blocked, banked, wrapped, stuffed, hung, heated, or endured? That mental world is perhaps the biggest difference between them and us. For many people now, bedtime means retreat from effort. In the medieval world, bedtime often demanded one final sequence of effort before the body could give in. Fires had to be managed, coverings had to be gathered, openings had to be closed, warmth had to be trapped before it vanished. Even the room itself might already have been chosen for the season, because people understood perfectly well that one corner of a building could feel survivable, while another felt like punishment. And still, for all of that, there was no guarantee of ease. This is one of the most human parts of the story. People wanted sleep then, as we want it now. They wanted relief. They wanted softness, if they could get it. They wanted the strange peace of being enclosed, of hearing the weather outside while remaining protected from it. They wanted their children warm. They wanted the old not to suffer too much. They wanted one decent night after many hard days. Across class, across region, across all the endless social differences of the medieval world, this much remained recognizably human. Nobody wanted to lie awake, shivering. And yet, many did. Some rooms were simply too large to keep warm. Some walls sweated damp into the air. Some shutters never closed properly. Some bedding trapped heat well, while some barely softened the night at all. A wealthy household might possess furs, heavy curtains, feather beds, and a chamber with its own hearth, and still the room could remain brutally cold. A poorer family might have none of that refinement, and yet sleep better simply because they were packed into a smaller space, closer to each other, closer to a central fire, closer to the accumulated warmth of bodies and breath. In that sense, medieval sleep was full of ironies. Grandeur did not always mean comfort. Stone did not always mean safety. Privacy did not always mean rest. There is something almost humbling about that. The more closely you look, the less the medieval night resembles a pageant of picturesque hardship, and the more it begins to feel like a series of practical, intelligent, deeply human adjustments. People were not passively suffering the cold. They were studying it with their bodies. They knew where it gathered, where it moved, where it entered, where it settled, and how long it took a bed to lose the heat of the person who had just left it. They knew which fabrics held warmth and which only looked fine by candlelight. They knew that the first moments in bed could be the worst, that the floor near dawn felt colder than the room had any right to be, and that the distance between a fire and a sleeping body could feel much greater at midnight than it had after supper. In other words, they knew winter intimately. And tonight, that is the world we are entering. Not the world of kings and battles first, though those things exist in the background. Not the world of grand history viewed from above, but the closer, quieter world. The world of a body trying to stay warm enough to sleep. The world of smoke in wool. The world of cold stone under rushes. The world of shut curtains, dim embers, and careful routine. The world in which the night was long, the room was colder than you wished, and survival depended less on any one object than on 1,000 ordinary acts of preparation. So, before the body settles, before the fire sinks lower, before the chamber closes around us, we begin with the cold itself. Because in the Middle Ages, cold was never just weather. It was a presence. And every night, people had to learn how to sleep beside it. By daylight, medieval buildings could look reassuringly solid. Thick walls, narrow openings, heavy doors, timber beams darkened by age and smoke. Everything about them suggested endurance. They could survive weather, war, hunger,
and time itself. But that same solidity concealed a quieter problem. A building made to resist attack was not necessarily a building made to hold warmth. In fact, some of the qualities that made a structure impressive to the eye or useful in conflict made it much harder to live in once the light faded and the temperature began to fall. It helps to begin with the wall. Stone has a kind of authority to it. It feels permanent, protective, honest. But in winter, stone behaves with a cold stubbornness that anyone who has touched it on a January morning will recognize immediately. It does not meet you halfway. It does not warm quickly. It keeps the memory of night deep inside itself and then gives that chill back slowly, hour after hour. A wooden house can feel cold and still somehow livable. A stone room, when unheated, can feel as if the cold has roots. It does not merely drift through the air, it lives in the surfaces. That mattered enormously in the Middle Ages, because so much of life happened in relation to surfaces. You leaned against walls, you sat on benches fixed against them, you crossed floors that carried the cold upward through leather soles and thin layers of plant rushes. You slept in rooms whose walls continued releasing the day's stored damp and chill long after the fire had faded. The body was in constant conversation with the building, and the building was rarely generous. This is why the cold of the medieval world was never only about outdoor temperature. A winter day might be bright. The sun might fall beautifully across a room for an hour or two. But once evening arrived, a badly heated building could feel like a trap that had quietly closed. The heat generated by bodies, candles, cooking, and fire might momentarily soften one part of a room, yet the larger structure remained indifferent. It absorbed warmth without gratitude and surrendered it upward or outward through chimneys, shutters, cracks, roof lines, and badly sealed joins. People knew this, even if they would not have explained it in the language of insulation or thermal mass.
They understood it by living inside it. And so, architecture became a strange bargain. The larger and more imposing the building, the harder it often was to make comfortable. Great halls were dramatic, but they asked the fire to warm a volume of air so large that much of the heat rose uselessly into smoke-black rafters. Towers offered status and defense, but they caught wind and exposed sleepers to sharper drafts. High-ceilinged chambers looked grand in the flicker of torchlight, yet the warmth gathered far above the level of the bed, leaving the body below to do what it could with blankets and endurance. Even smaller rooms could disappoint if they sat on the wrong side of a building, or caught no sun, or backed onto exposed stone that had never really dried out since autumn. The medieval home, in other words, was not one thing. It was a patchwork of microclimates. People learned this intimately. They knew which room stayed tolerable longest after sunset. They knew where the morning light came first in winter. They knew which corner remained damp, which passage pulled wind through it, which stairwell always felt 2 degrees colder than it ought to.
and which chamber might be worth the trouble of moving bedding into when the season turned harsh. This sort of knowledge rarely appears first in heroic histories, but it sat at the center of everyday life. The body noticed what the chronicles ignored. There is also a class dimension here, though not in the simple way we might assume. Wealth could buy finer materials, more servants, more textiles, larger fireplaces, and access to rooms reserved from common use. But wealth also often came wrapped in architecture built to impress. The more powerful the household, the more likely its residents contained spaces too vast, too ceremonious, or too exposed to ever feel truly warm in winter.
A modest timber dwelling with a low roof and one hard-working hearth could shelter heat far better than a magnificent chamber meant to signal rank. That did not make poverty pleasant. Poor households faced terrible hardship of their own. But it did mean that warmth and status did not always travel together. This is one of the enduring ironies of medieval domestic life. The very forms of building associated with prestige could make sleep more difficult. Imagine the difference, not abstractly, but physically. In one place, a family sleeps in a compact room where everyone's breath gathers in the same shared air, where walls of wattle and daub hold what the fire gives, where bodies, animals, and cooking have all left behind a residue of warmth. In another place, a noble lies beneath a handsome canopy in a chamber whose walls are thick enough to survive siege, but whose size and stonework make every source of heat feel isolated. One room smells of stew, smoke, and closeness. The other smells of wool, cold plaster, and distance. Which sleeper wakes warmer is not always the one dressed in better cloth. The building itself could also be damp in a way modern people rarely tolerate for long. Water entered medieval life constantly. It seeped, condensed, froze, and reappeared. A room might not merely be cold, but clammy. Moisture could gather on walls, especially when a hearth briefly heated the air only for that warmth to meet cold stone. Window openings, however covered, invited weather in. Roofs leaked. Foundations remained stubbornly wet. The result was not the crisp dryness of winter cold that some people today even enjoy, but a deeper unpleasantness. A cold that clung to fabric, settled into bedding, and made the body feel as though it never fully dried out. You can sense how much this mattered when you picture the effort people spent softening interiors. Wall hangings, wooden paneling, heavy curtains, floor coverings, benches with cushions, beds lifted high from the ground, shutters fastened carefully at dusk. None of these were trivial embellishments. They were part of a long argument with the building itself. A room was rarely left bare because bare stone was not neutral. It was active. It pulled at heat, reflected sound harshly, and made every draft feel sharper. Cloth did not simply decorate a wall, it interrupted the relationship between body and stone. Even if the difference was modest, modest differences mattered when repeated over 6 months of cold weather. And yet it would be a mistake to imagine medieval people as merely miserable victims of poor construction. What they possessed instead was a kind of practical environmental intelligence. They understood that a building could not be made universally warm, so warmth had to be concentrated. Not everywhere, somewhere. Around the evening fire, inside the bed curtains, in the smaller chamber, near the kitchen, against the south-facing wall, beside another body, under the thicker blanket. Their comfort was rarely total, but it was often skillfully arranged.
This is where the human story becomes richer than any simple contrast between cold past and comfortable present. Because the Middle Ages did not solve winter by mastering it. They solved it by narrowing it, by refusing to warm the whole world and instead trying to make one corner, one bed, one body, 1 hour of the night more bearable than the rest. They made choices that were local, repeated, and specific. Which room tonight? Which bed? Which curtain drawn tighter? Which opening stuffed against the wind? Which child moved closer to the hearth? Which elderly relative given the inner chamber? Which servant sent ahead to prepare the bed? The scale was intimate, but the intelligence behind it was real. You can almost feel the knowledge accumulated over generations. Not theory, but inheritance. A grandmother telling a daughter which room catches less wind.
A steward knowing when to move hangings before the first hard frost. A servant recognizing by touch that the bedding is too damp to be safe. A household learning year after year that this side of the building cannot be trusted in February, that the passage by the stair chills the bed if the door is left ajar, that no amount of rank changes what north wind does when it finds a weak shutter. Buildings taught people how to live with them, often harshly, and nowhere was that lesson clearer than at night, when the body ceased moving, the fire lowered, and the structure revealed what it really held. During the day, a room could be managed. Bodies moved through it, doors opened and closed, work generated heat, cooking sent warmth outward. But when the night settled and activity dropped away, the truth of the building emerged. Some rooms kept a little mercy in them. Others seemed to strip it out of the air. So, before we get to blankets, dogs, warming pans, or shared beds, it matters to understand this foundation. Medieval people were not simply trying to sleep in cold weather. They were trying to sleep inside buildings that often behaved as if human comfort were an afterthought. And that was true because, in many ways, it was. These structures were built first to stand, to defend, to impress, to contain households, goods, loyalties, labor, prayer, and authority. Warmth came later, improvised within them by people who understood that surviving winter required more than walls. It required reading those walls correctly. It required knowing that power could live in a building more easily than heat, and once evening fell, that difference could be felt on the skin. The cold that lived in the stone. Why medieval buildings held power better than heat. The last warmth of evening, beds as small private climates. Wool, fur, linen, and the weight of survival. Why fire was never enough. Shared warmth, family, servants, and dogs. Why the poor could sleep warmer than the rich. Windows, smoke, Smell, and the price of warmth. Night clothes, broken sleep, and the work of staying warm. Children, the elderly, and the most fragile bodies. Winter dawn, and the human art of enduring. Section 3. By evening, much of medieval life moved instinctively toward warmth. Not comfort in the modern sense, not softness, privacy, or ease, just warmth, however temporary, however unevenly shared. The day was ending, light was thinning, and the body knew what was coming next. Once darkness settled properly, the cold would feel sharper, floors harder, water crueler, and every unheated space in the building would begin to reveal its true character. So, before sleep, people gathered where heat still existed. This was one of the most important rhythms of the medieval night.
For a little while, the household drew inward. In a great house, that often meant the hall. Long tables, firelight on wood and metal, benches pulled nearer the hearth than usual, servants moving through the haze of smoke, dogs weaving underfoot in search of scraps and company. In a smaller home, it meant something even more intimate. Family clustered close to the hearth, bowls in hand, shoulders nearly touching, the whole room defined by one source of heat and one circle of light. In both cases, the same truth applied. Warmth did not belong to the building. It belonged to the fire and to whoever stayed near it. That makes the evening meal feel different when you look at it closely. It was not just nourishment, it was thermal strategy. A hot pottage, ale warmed near the hearth, broth thick enough to sit heavily in the stomach, bread held near the fire before eating. These were not luxuries of mood. They were ways of sending warmth inward before the long, colder hours began. The medieval body understood something very simple. Going to bed cold was dangerous. Better to eat warm, drink warm, sit warm, and carry whatever heat you could into the next room before it fled.
You can imagine the scene with very little effort because it is so bodily. A pair of hands held close to the flames until the knuckles sting, boots drying by the edge of the hearth, damp wool beginning, finally, to lose its raw chill. The smell of smoke caught in hair and sleeves, the face hot on one side, the back still cold. Someone turning a cup between both palms before drinking. Someone reluctant to stand, because standing means leaving the only truly livable part of the room, and that reluctance mattered. People lingered near evening fires not only because they were tired, but because they dreaded the moment after. The moment when warmth had to be abandoned. This is easy to miss from a distance. We tend to imagine bedtime as the reward waiting at the end of the evening. For many medieval people, the opposite was often true. The best part of the night, physically at least, might be the hour before bed, when the body was still close to the hearth, food still sat warm in the stomach, and human company made the room feel smaller and more merciful. Bed could be shelter, yes, but first it was cold sheets, cold air, a colder chamber, and the brief but vivid misery of undressing, preparing, and lowering oneself into an environment that had not yet accepted the body's heat. So the evening hall, or the evening hearth, became something almost ceremonial. It was the last communal pocket of warmth before the private labor of sleep began. In larger households, rank shaped exactly how this looked. The high table, the better seat, the closer place to the flames, these could all determine who sat in relative ease and who remained out on the colder edges. Heat, like so many things in the medieval world, followed hierarchy. If the fire warmed only a limited area, then nearness to it mattered. Warmth could be felt as privilege. A lord's chair might stand where the face glowed red from the hearth, while servants further out felt the chill pressing against their backs and ankles the entire time. But even privilege had limits. A great fire could light a room magnificently and still fail to heat it fully. Heat rose too high. Smoke carried warmth upward. Vast interiors swallowed the rest. So what mattered most in the evening was not that the room had been conquered, but that for a brief time certain bodies had. Hands warmed, feet thawed. Supper softened the ache of the day. Conversation, prayer, fatigue, and firelight combined into something close to peace. That peace was fragile. The farther medieval people had to travel from the hearth to the bed, the more they would have felt its fragility. A small cottage might allow the body to move from fire to sleeping place in only a few steps, keeping some of the warmth intact. A larger residence stretched out the transition: corridor, stair, passage, door, another door. Each threshold drained heat. Each stone surface seemed to take a little back. By the time a person reached the bedchamber, the body might feel as though the evening had already been spent. And this is where the emotional life of medieval sleep becomes very clear. People were not just managing cold, they were managing the knowledge of cold, the anticipation of it, the tiredness that comes when you already know the bed will not feel welcoming for several minutes, perhaps longer. The small dread of lifting blankets that have not yet warmed, the instinct to postpone that moment by staying near the fire 1 cup longer, 1 story longer, 1 prayer longer. You can almost see it. The hall is dimmer now. The meal is ending. A servant scrapes bowls together. Someone adds 1 more log to the hearth, not because it makes economic sense, but because nobody wants the room to surrender yet. A child grows drowsy against a shoulder. A dog has settled in the warm, ash-scented patch near the fire. Voices lower. The room is still not comfortable by modern standards, but it is alive, and more importantly, it is warm enough. This was often the nearest thing to coziness that the medieval night could honestly offer. Not the bed itself, at least not yet. Not the chamber.
Not the long hours after midnight. But this moment, right here, when fire and food and human closeness briefly held the cold at the edge of the room. That is why evening mattered so much. It was not merely the end of work. It was preparation for exposure. Because once the gathering broke, people carried what they could into the darkness. Warmth in their bodies, smoke in their clothes, heaviness in their limbs, and the memory of flame in their skin. Then they rose, reluctantly, and went to prepare a smaller, more private defense against the night. The hall gave them the last shared warmth. The bed would have to do the rest. If the evening hearth was the last warmth shared by a household, the bed was where that warmth had to be trapped, protected, and made to last. A medieval bed was not just a place to lie down. It was a device for survival. That is why the bed of anyone with means so often rose high above the floor, stood on a heavy frame, and gathered curtains around itself like walls within walls. Modern people often look at these beds and see ceremony, carving, status, display. And of course, those things were there. But beneath all the grandeur sat a very practical idea. If the room could not be made warm, then perhaps 1 small pocket inside it could. This was one of the quietest but smartest adaptations of medieval domestic life. People learned to stop thinking of warmth in terms of entire rooms. Rooms were too large, too drafty, too unpredictable. The more realistic goal was to build a much smaller climate around the body itself. Bed curtains helped do that. So did heavy coverlets. So did canopies overhead, thick fabrics at the sides, and bedding layered densely enough to hold the heat of breath and skin once it had finally accumulated. The result was not luxury in the modern sense. It was concentration. Warmth gathered best where space narrowed. That is why the inside of a bed could feel profoundly different from the chamber around it. Outside the curtains, a room might still breathe cold through the shutters. Air moved. Stone held its chill. Sound echoed faintly. But once the curtains were drawn and the body settled under enough weight, the bed began, slowly, to become a world of its own. Not warm at first, perhaps. The first minutes could still be miserable. Linen cold against the skin, blankets holding none of you yet. the body shivering as it tried to seed the space with its own heat. But after a while, if the bedding was good and the curtains thick, the air inside might soften. Breath stayed closer. Drafts lost their edge. The bed became less like furniture and more like a shelter made of cloth, wood, and patience. You can feel the logic of it instantly. Raise the sleeper off the floor, where cold settled thickest. Hang fabric to interrupt moving air. Add enough layers above and below that the heat made by the body has somewhere to stay. Reduce open space. Reduce exposure. Reduce loss. It is such a simple idea that it almost disappears from view, and yet it changed the experience of the night. For wealthier households, this could mean large framed beds with testers above and curtains on all sides, the kind later generations romanticized because they looked stately and theatrical. But the real drama was not visual, it was physical. Close the curtains, and the room no longer touched you in the same way. The cold was still there, surrounding the structure, pressing against it, but it no longer moved freely over the sleeper's face and hands. The body, finally, had boundaries working in its favor. That sense of enclosure mattered emotionally, too, because medieval sleep was not only about temperature, it was about vulnerability. Darkness, illness, drafts, noise from corridors, footsteps in the passage, the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of timber, the knowledge that the fire was fading somewhere else in the building, all of this meant that being enclosed could feel like relief in more than one sense.
The bed curtains muffled not only air, but the room itself. They gave privacy where little privacy existed. They dimmed light. They narrowed the world. They let the sleeper feel, at least for a few hours, that the night had been pushed back. Even humbler beds followed the same principle in simpler form. A household without elaborate hangings might still use layered blankets, wall cloths near the sleeping area, or the strategic placement of bedding in the least exposed part of a room. A simple pallet could be moved, a mattress could be laid near inner walls rather than outer ones, a child could be tucked between adults, or a bed pushed closer to retained heat from a hearth or kitchen wall. The details changed according to rank and means, but the underlying intelligence remained the same. Shrink the sleeping world until the body can defend it. That is perhaps the best way to understand medieval bedding as a whole. It was an argument against space. The larger the cold world around you, the more necessary it became to create a smaller one inside it. And this is why the first moments in bed would have felt so important. A servant might warm the sheets beforehand if the household could afford the trouble. Someone might quickly close curtains after the sleeper entered, sealing in whatever body heat began to form. A blanket might be tucked close under the feet and along the shoulders, not for neatness, but because gaps mattered. A badly tucked bed leaked warmth the way a badly shuttered room leaked air. The body would have noticed every weakness, cold at the feet first, a line of draft across the face, moisture in the sheets, a mattress too thin to lift the body from the chill below, bedding too light to hold heat after the first hour. Everything that failed would be remembered. Everything that worked would be repeated. That is how these practices endured, not because someone wrote down a perfect system, but because people kept the habits that made nights survivable. Imagine now the difference between entering such a bed and entering a modern one. Today, comfort often feels passive. The mattress is there. The room is regulated. The bedding is dry and waiting. But in the Middle Ages, the bed often had to be activated,
Its warmth did not pre-exist the sleeper. It had to be made, coaxed, built up from cold fabric toward something livable. The bed was less like a finished comfort than like a shelter that only came into being once the body, blankets, and enclosed space began cooperating with one another. That makes medieval sleep feel far more active than ours. You did not simply collapse into bed. You entered it with intention. You closed it around yourself. You made small adjustments that could mean the difference between a miserable hour and an endurable night. The curtains were not decoration. The height was not vanity. The layering was not excess. Every part of it answered the same question. How can a human body keep enough of itself warm until dawn? And perhaps that is why medieval beds, even when beautiful, never quite lose their seriousness. They are lovely to look at, yes, but beneath the carved wood and rich fabric sits a blunt human truth. People were building one of the only private climates available to them. Not a room, not a house, not a fortress, just a bed. And on many winter nights, that was the warmest world they had. Inside that small climate of the bed, warmth depended less on one miraculous object than on layers. Layers under the body, layers over it, layers worn to bed, layers hung around the sleeping space. Layers that scratched, pressed, smelled of lanolin or smoke, and yet made the difference between a tolerable night and a punishing one. Medieval people did not think of bedding as a soft aesthetic choice. They thought of it more like weather gear for stillness. And nothing mattered more than cloth. Linen came first, often closest to the skin. It was washable, relatively smooth, and widely useful, though not especially warm on its own. Then came wool, far more important to winter sleep than elegance ever was. Wool held heat, even when the air was bad and the room damp. It was heavy, imperfect, sometimes itchy, often rough by modern standards. But it worked. Fur, when available, added another level entirely. It was not only a signal of rank, though it certainly served that purpose. In cold seasons, it was also practical, dense, and deeply effective at trapping warmth where finer cloth alone could not. This is why inventories of medieval households so often cared about bedding in such detail. Because bedding was never trivial property. A good coverlet was protection. A fur lining was insurance. An extra blanket might mean the difference between rest and a night spent half awake, feet aching, and shoulders tight with cold. We tend to imagine wealth in terms of silver, plate, or embroidered garments, but in winter, some of the most meaningful signs of comfort were quieter than that. A bed that held heat well was a form of power. Not dramatic power, bodily power. The power to sleep without suffering too much. And yet, even the best layers came with compromise. Weight was warmth, but weight also pinned the body down. Thick blankets could press so heavily that turning in bed became its own little disturbance. Wool warmed, but it could itch. Fur insulated, but it held smell. Linen felt cleanest, but not warmest. A feather bed softened the body beautifully, yet might hold heat unevenly or sink too deeply. Straw was cheaper and common, but rustled, flattened, and had a way of reminding the sleeper that comfort had limits. Medieval bedding was rarely perfect. It was simply the best system available for holding on to human heat in an inhospitable room.
You can almost feel the bodily logic of it. First, the cold shock of entering the bed, then the slow warming of the linen nearest the skin, then the greater, heavier warmth of wool above. Then the sense, if you were fortunate,
of fur trapping everything closer still. Not instant comfort, but an accumulation, a building up. Heat that began in the body and was persuaded not to leave too quickly. That is what made these layers so important. They did not create warmth from nothing. They prevented loss. Medieval people understood that instinctively. They knew the danger of gaps around the shoulders, the misery of cold feet, the way exposed hands could ruin the rest of the body's peace. They knew that a blanket thrown loosely over a sleeper was not the same as one properly arranged. They knew that bedding had to work with the body's shape, not just lie on top of it. In that sense, much of winter sleep was about sealing, tucking, folding, pressing cloth into service until it behaved less like decoration and more like a barrier. The materials themselves carried the world outside into the bed. Wool brought with it the animal it came from, faintly, through smell and texture. Fur was even more direct. Linen carried the memory of labor, washing, drying, folding, mending. None of it felt sterile. A medieval bed was full of the world. Sheep, geese, skins, straw, smoke, damp air, human use. That is part of why it felt lived rather than pristine. Comfort in the Middle Ages was almost always material, in a very literal sense. Warmth came from things that had been grown, shorn, woven, stuffed, cured, or stitched by hand. There is also something deeply human in the way people relied on weight. Today, many people still find comfort in heaviness, in blankets that press gently down and make the body feel held. Medieval sleepers knew that sensation too, though theirs was less optional. The heaviness of winter bedding could be exhausting, but it could also be reassuring. Once everything was in place, once the covers had settled over the body and stopped shifting so much, the bed could feel not merely warmer, but safer. The layers created pressure, enclosure, stillness. They told the body, in effect, stay here. Keep your heat. Do not give it away. For poorer households, the same principles held even when the materials were rougher. Coarse wool instead of fine, straw instead of feathers, patched blankets instead of richly lined coverlets, sheepskin where sable or marten was impossible. The hierarchy of quality changed, but the strategy did not. Everyone was making the same basic calculation. What can be placed above and below the body to make the night less punishing? The answer might look grand in one household and humble in another, but the intelligence behind it belonged to all. That is why it would be wrong to treat these layers as mere symbols. They were not just signs of class, they were techniques. And, like all good techniques, they were judged by results. Did the bedding keep the feet warm? Did the shoulders stay covered? Did damp creep in by morning? Could a child sleep through the coldest part of the night? Could an old man wake without every joint feeling seized by the weather? These were the real tests. Not elegance first, but endurance. Imagine, then, a sleeper settling under all of this. The first sensation is resistance, the cold fabric, the shifting weight, the minor discomfort of arranging everything properly. Then, slowly, the body begins to disappear beneath the layers. Breath warms the air near the face. Heat gathers in the hollow behind the knees.
Toes stop aching, shoulders soften. The bed has not become luxurious exactly, but it has become workable. And on a harsh winter night, workable is very close to mercy. It is also worth remembering that medieval people often wore part of their protection to bed. Night was not a time for exposed skin, if skin could be covered. A cap, a long shirt, wrapped feet, extra cloth over the shoulders, all of it extended the system of layers beyond the bed itself. In this sense, there was no clear line between clothing and bedding. Both belonged to the same project. The body was being packaged for survival.
That may sound severe, but it also carried tenderness, because much of this labor was done for others. A parent tucking blankets close around a child, a servant preparing a lord's bed, a wife arranging covers for an ill husband, an older daughter sharing warmth with younger siblings under one heavy pile of wool. Warmth in the Middle Ages was not only stored in fabric, it was administered through care. Someone noticed the draft, someone added one more layer, someone kept the better blanket for the weakest sleeper. That is the real emotional center of medieval bedding, not opulence, though sometimes it was opulent, not quaint historical charm, but care made visible in cloth. The layers mattered because the body mattered, because morning had to be reached, because the night was long, because winter did not forgive carelessness, and so people laid linen, gathered wool, prized fur, stuffed mattresses, mended seams, folded blankets, and learned through repetition exactly how much weight a human body needed between itself and the dark. They built survival out of softness, or something as close to softness as their world could provide. And once those layers were in place, one stubborn truth remained. Even then, the fire was never enough. For all the importance of fire in the medieval imagination, it is worth saying plainly that fire was often a disappointing heater. It looked stronger than it was. A roaring hearth could dominate a room visually. Flames leapt, logs cracked, sparks lifted into the smoke, light ran across walls and faces, and from a distance it seemed impossible that such a thing would fail to warm everything around it. But warmth is not the same as spectacle. In many medieval rooms, especially the larger ones, the fire heated a circle, not a chamber. Step close, and your hands might sting pleasantly. Step back even a little, and the cold returned with humiliating speed. This was one of the great frustrations of winter life. The flame was real. The labor of feeding it was real. The wood consumed by it was real. And yet, the comfort it produced remained painfully local. Part of the problem was scale. A great hall or large chamber held too much air, too much vertical space, too much stone. Fire sent warmth upward, where it gathered uselessly among beams and smoke-black rafters, while bodies remained below in the zone where comfort actually mattered. A huge chimney solved one problem by carrying smoke away, but it also stole heat with a kind of ruthless efficiency. The fire lived magnificently, but much of its warmth escaped before anyone could keep it. That is why medieval people stayed near fire, rather than assuming the fire had warmed the room. The distinction matters. A modern heated space gives the illusion that comfort belongs to the whole interior. In the Middle Ages, comfort often belonged only to proximity. One place by the hearth might feel almost luxurious to the hands and face. A few feet away, another person sat with cold knees and a stiff neck, pretending perhaps to be warmer than they were.
Heat in winter did not spread equally. It followed rank, luck, timing, and patience. And even when the fire worked as well as it could, it brought other inconveniences with it. Smoke was the most obvious. Chimneys improved medieval life enormously where they existed well, but they did not eliminate the problem. Fireplaces could smoke back into the room when weather shifted or fuel burned badly. Smaller dwellings often fared worse, especially where smoke lingered low before escaping through roofs or crude openings. Eyes watered, throats burned, cloth absorbed the smell. The same flame that made the room marginally livable also blackened walls, darkened rafters, and left its taste in the mouth by morning. There was always a bargain at the hearth, warmth on one side, soot on the other. You can imagine what this felt like near bedtime. A person stands close to the fire, turning slowly, warming one side of the body, and then the other.
The front of the legs begin to thaw. The back remains cold. Hands open toward the blaze until the skin dries and tightens. Then the person steps away, perhaps only to fetch something from a bench or chest, and the cold falls over the body again so quickly that the loss feels personal. It is the speed of that loss that makes medieval fire seem so fragile. You could spend an hour near it and still carry away far less warmth than you hoped. This is also why fuel mattered so much. Fire was not only a comfort, but a resource problem. A household needed wood constantly in winter, and good wood at that. Too green, and it smoked. Too little, and the heat failed. Too much burnt too quickly, and the reserve for later hours shrank. Fires had to be fed, watched, banked, coaxed. They could not simply be wished into usefulness. Someone gathered the wood, someone carried it in. Someone noticed when the embers were dropping too fast. Someone rose later in the night to keep the room or hall from falling completely into the cold. The labor around warmth was almost as important as the warmth itself. This becomes clearest when you think about the fire not as an object, but as a schedule. It begins the day dull, is built stronger as work and meals require it, becomes socially central in the evening, and then, depending on the household and the room, is either banked carefully for the night or allowed to fade. In each phase, it gives just enough to matter, but rarely enough to solve the larger problem. The fire did not defeat winter. It interrupted it. And yet people loved it for that. Because interruption was often all they could ask. There is a tenderness in the way human beings gather around inadequate warmth. The fire is not sufficient, but everyone leans toward it anyway. Stories are told near it. Supper is eaten near it. Wet shoes are dried near it. Children drift toward sleep near it. Elderly bodies sit close to it for longer than anyone says aloud is necessary.
Even dogs understand the geometry of its comfort. The hearth becomes the emotional center of the room because it is one of the only places where the body stops feeling actively threatened by the air. This emotional truth matters as much as the physical one. Fire did not only warm, it reassured. Its light made rooms feel inhabited. Its sound filled silences that would otherwise seem too large. Its presence said that the household had not surrendered. As long as something burned, however imperfectly, the night had not fully taken the room. That may be why even a small fire could feel psychologically larger than its actual heat output. The body knows when warmth is insufficient, but the mind still takes comfort in visible resistance. Of course, there were limits to that comfort. A room with a fire could still be bitterly cold at the bed. A hallway beyond the hearth's reach could feel like outdoors. Water, left too near an outer wall, might still freeze. Breath might still show in the air by dawn. To say medieval people had fire is not to say they had heat in the modern sense. They had a local defense against cold, costly to maintain, unreliable at a distance, and constantly shadowed by smoke. That reality shaped nighttime habits more than any romantic image of the hearth might suggest. People delayed leaving it. They prepared for the walk from fire to bed as if it were a meaningful thermal loss, because it was. They used other strategies precisely because the fire could not do enough on its own. Curtains around the bed, heavy bedding, shared sleeping, warmed stones, nightcaps, tightly shuttered windows, all these things only make full sense once you accept that the fire, for all its symbolic power, never truly solved the problem. It helped profoundly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes at great cost, but helped is not the same as saved. And that is what makes medieval warmth so interesting. It was never a single technology. It was an ecosystem of partial answers.
Fire belonged at the center of it, certainly, but only as one answer among many, and not always the best one. In fact, the most sensible households understood its limits clearly. They used it to prepare the body, to soften the evening, to warm food and air and hands, but they did not trust it alone to protect a sleeper through the longest, coldest hours. By midnight, firelight could be memory as much as presence. The body would then rely on what had been carried away from the hearth: warmth in the belly, warmth in the hands, warmth stored briefly in cloth, and the fading trace of heat in the skin. After that, survival belonged to bedding, enclosure, and company. And sometimes company worked better than flame. On the coldest nights, the difference between sleeping alone and sleeping among others could be the difference between hardship and something almost bearable. Warmth was not only stored in blankets or held near a fire, it lived in bodies. This is one of the most deeply human facts about medieval sleep, and one of the easiest for us to underestimate, because modern ideals of privacy have changed how we think a bed ought to feel. We imagine sleep as solitary, personal, sealed off. But in much of the Middle Ages, warmth often came through nearness. Spouses, children, servants in adjoining spaces, siblings under shared covers, companions on pallets, and, very often, animals. A body at rest produced heat, and in a cold world, heat was too valuable to waste at a distance. That made shared sleep practical long before it was ever sentimental. A child tucked beside a parent slept warmer. An old relative placed nearer other bodies stood a better chance through the night. Servants sleeping in the same chamber as their superiors were not always there only for attendance or security. Their presence altered the temperature of the room itself. In poorer homes, where one main room might hold the entire household, this truth was even more obvious.
Warmth pooled where people gathered. The closer the bodies, the less each one had to fend for itself against the cold. You can feel the logic immediately. One sleeping body must warm its own small space from nothing. Several bodies begin with an advantage. Breath accumulates. Air inside shared coverings softens faster. The cold does not disappear, but it has farther to travel before it reaches skin. The difference might only be a few degrees, perhaps less, but a few degrees mattered enormously at night. Medieval survival was often made out of small margins like that. This also changes how we understand crowded sleeping arrangements. What looks to us like lack of comfort or lack of privacy was often, in part, a technology of warmth. Families did not only sleep close because they had no alternatives. They slept close because closeness worked. A small room full of breathing bodies could become more tolerable than a grand chamber containing one privileged sleeper alone beneath expensive cloth. The hierarchy of medieval life did not erase biology. Heat still moved from body to body, whether the people involved were noble or poor, kin or servant, wanted the intimacy or merely accepted it. And animals belonged to this economy too. Dogs especially appear again and again around medieval sleeping life because they offered something simple and immediate: living warmth. A hound at the foot of the bed was not merely charming, it was useful. A smaller dog curled against the legs or the feet could relieve the worst ache of cold extremities. In a world where the feet often suffered first and longest, that mattered more than we might think. Even where formal etiquette frowned on too much animal intimacy in bed, practical life had a way of making exceptions on bitter nights. Animals warmed more than noble chambers. In humbler settings, the line between human sleeping space and animal shelter could become thin indeed. A cottage with livestock under the same roof was not only noisier and more pungent, it was warmer. The smell of animals, the closeness of their breathing, the heat of their bodies rising into shared air. All of this made life harder in some ways and more survivable in others. A modern person might focus first on the inconvenience or the filth. A medieval sleeper, lying down in deep winter, might have focused on the fact that the room would not kill them before dawn. This is one reason the medieval night resists easy romanticizing. Its comforts were real, but they were rarely clean or elegant by our standards. Shared warmth came with sounds, smells, and bodily inconvenience. Someone coughed. Someone shifted. A child kicked free of the blankets. A dog scratched, sighed, or brought in the smell of the outdoors. Blankets were tugged unevenly. Space was negotiated by sleepy, half-conscious bodies. Yet all of this could still feel better than solitude in a freezing room. Better restless than numb. Better crowded than exposed. There is something moving in that exchange, because warmth shared is also vulnerability shared. To sleep near someone is to trust them with your unconscious body, your breath, your weakness. Medieval households did this not because they were unusually sentimental, but because life required forms of interdependence that modern comfort often hides from us. You stayed warm because other people existed near you. Children learned this early. The sick depended on it. The old were folded into it. Even healthy adults, if they were honest, often benefited from it more than they might have wished to admit. This also gave medieval sleep an emotional texture different from ours. The night was not necessarily private, but it was full of forms of care. Someone made room. Someone gave up the warmer place near the center for the smaller child. Someone let the dog stay. Someone shared the better blanket. Someone lay wakeful for a while, feeling the breathing of others and knowing, without saying it aloud, that this was how the household got through winter.
Not one heroic act, just accumulated nearness. You can imagine a room after the fire has fallen low. The final murmur of voices has faded. The boards settle. A child has at last gone quiet. A dog has found its place and turned twice before lying down. Under the blankets, warmth gathers slowly where bodies touch first. Shoulder against shoulder, feet against legs, small curled forms tucked into larger ones. The room itself may still be cold enough to see the faintest mist of breath if someone sits up, but under the coverings, the cold is being resisted not by architecture or engineering, but by company. That is perhaps the simplest medieval answer to winter. If one body is not enough, add another, and another, if needed. This was not always pleasant, it was not always chosen freely, but it was effective enough to endure as habit across households, regions, and classes. Even in monasteries, dormitories, and barracks, where intimacy followed discipline rather than kinship, the same reality held. Rows of sleepers warmed a space differently than isolated bodies ever could. Human beings made one another more survivable. That truth also complicates our assumptions about status. A wealthy person might possess a better bed, richer fabrics, and more privacy, and still sleep colder than a poor family piled together under rough wool in a low room. Poverty remained brutal. Nothing about this makes it enviable. But when the question is warmth alone, intimacy could outrank elegance. The body cared more for nearby heat than for display. And that makes medieval sleep feel unexpectedly modern in one small, honest way. Even now, many people sleep better with presence nearby. A partner, a child in the next room, the weight of a pet at the foot of the bed. We still trust closeness to soften the night, though our reasons may feel more emotional than practical. In the Middle Ages, the practical and the emotional were harder to separate. To be accompanied was often to be warmer. To be warmer was often to be safer. From there, it is only a short step to love, duty, habit, tenderness, or simple gratitude. So, when we picture medieval bodies surviving winter, we should not imagine each sleeper sealed into some lonely contest with the cold. More often, they endured it in clusters, with blankets pulled close, with feet pressed against fur or flesh, with breath shared in the dark, with sleep made possible not by solitude, but by the stubborn human instinct to gather together when the night turned hard. And that instinct, for all its simplicity, sometimes worked better than wealth. If warmth followed bodies more faithfully than it followed status, then one of the quiet ironies of medieval life begins to make sense. The poor could sometimes sleep warmer than the rich. Not better overall, not more safely, not with greater dignity, ease, or health. Poverty in the Middle Ages was brutal, exhausting, and full of vulnerability. But when the question is narrowed to one cold winter night, to the body under blankets trying to hold enough heat until dawn, the answer becomes less intuitive. A grand life did not always mean a warm one. The reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Poor households often lived smaller. A modest dwelling, even a crude one, asked less of a fire. Its roof sat lower. Its sleeping places were closer to the hearth. Its inhabitants were packed nearer one another. Heat from cooking lingered where people slept, because the same space served many purposes. Human and animal warmth accumulated instead of dispersing into ceremonial emptiness. Nothing about this arrangement was luxurious. It was smoky, cramped, noisy, and often foul by modern standards. But warmth, unlike prestige, prefers concentration.
Large, elite spaces suffered from the opposite problem. They were designed not only to shelter life, but to display rank. Bigger rooms, taller ceilings, separate chambers, impressive halls, longer passages, more exposed masonry,
More distance between the hearth and the bed, more distance between people themselves. All of this looked and functioned differently from the compact life of a poorer household. Yet, once the fire burned low and bodies became still, those grand dimensions often turned against comfort. Heat thinned out, stone reclaimed the room. Privacy became another word for thermal disadvantage. That is the paradox. A peasant family under rough wool in one smoky room might sleep in air that was ugly but comparatively merciful, while a noble beneath furs in a handsome chamber might still feel the bite of cold through the gaps of a larger world. You can picture the contrast clearly. In one setting, a low fire smolders at the center of a cottage. The roof traps smoke and some portion of the heat. A pot has been hanging over the hearth. Its warmth still lingers in the room. The family eats, sleeps, coughs, argues, mends, and dreams within the same close envelope of air. Their bed may be little more than straw and shared coverings. A child turns in sleep. A parent pulls the blanket higher. Somewhere nearby, an animal shifts, adding its own warmth to the room, whether welcomed for companionship or simple practicality. The room is not fresh, it is not quiet, but it is not empty. In the other setting, a noble chamber sits above a long corridor. The shutters are closed, the curtains drawn, the bed arranged carefully. The fabrics are finer, the mattress is softer. The occupant may have eaten better, dressed better, and entered bed with more ceremony. And yet the room itself remains difficult. It is too large to answer the body fully. The floor is cold, the walls hold damp. The fire in the chamber, if there is one, never reaches the entire space. A person can possess every visible sign of superiority and still spend the night defending their feet against cold. This is one reason medieval domestic life feels so interesting when viewed from below rather than above. Official power and bodily comfort do not always line up. The body is stubbornly democratic in what it needs. It wants warmth near itself, air that does not move too much, coverings that hold heat, and as little wasted space as possible. It does not care about prestige, if prestige means sleeping farther from the only working source of heat. It does not care about architectural drama, if architecture makes the room harder to inhabit. In winter, the body has very simple loyalties. This should not be mistaken for some sentimental reversal where poverty becomes secretly preferable. It was not. Poorer people still slept on rougher surfaces, suffered more from damp and vermin, owned fewer spare layers, and faced far greater risk if illness entered the household. Their warmth could coexist with exhaustion, hunger, and chronic discomfort. But that is precisely why this contrast is so revealing. It shows that medieval life cannot be understood by symbols alone. A feather bed is not the whole story, neither is a dirt floor. To know how people actually slept, you have to ask where the heat stayed and where it went. Sometimes it stayed with the poor, not because the world favored them, but because necessity had forced their lives into a shape that held warmth more efficiently. There is also a psychological side to this. A crowded room may limit privacy, but it reduces isolation. A person in a small dwelling hears breathing, movement, embers, animals, the soft continuation of life. A person in a large chamber hears the same winter through distance.
Wind against shutters, a loose board, a dull echo in the passage, the far-off settling of the building, and the larger silence of a room whose size exceeds the comfort available within it. One room says endurance through closeness, the other says exposure dressed in privilege. That difference changes the emotional tone of the night. It changes how one enters sleep.
A peasant body may lie down, tired beyond thought, enclosed by family, used to the smells and sounds of a shared room, and surrender quickly, because the room itself is already warm with life. A noble body may lie down in comparative elegance, but remain alert longer, waiting for the bed to heat, adjusting covers, noticing the air beyond the curtains, aware that a whole chamber of cold still exists just inches away. If anything, the contrast reveals how medieval people adapted, not simply by possessing more, but by arranging life more closely around the body's needs. The poor were often forced into this arrangement. The rich often had to recreate it artificially. Bed curtains imitated enclosure. Furs imitated the warmth that bodies would have provided. Servants nearby, dogs at the foot of the bed, smaller inner chambers, all these were ways of recovering, within elite life, some of the thermal logic already present in humbler dwellings. Wealth added tools, but it did not erase the underlying principle. Warmth likes density. And that principle kept reappearing everywhere. In the choice of smaller winter rooms, in the use of kitchens and inner chambers, in the crowding of children together, in the closeness of monks in dormitories, in the heat retained by low-roofed homes, in the decision to sleep near animals when necessary. Medieval life, for all its hierarchy, kept circling back to the same physical truth. To survive the night, people needed their world drawn in tighter around them. There is something almost tender in that, even when the conditions themselves were hard, because it reminds us that survival often looked less like conquest and more like compression, less like mastering winter and more like making one little pocket where winter could not quite take everything. So when we picture medieval sleep, we should be careful not to confuse grandeur with ease. A noble bed could be beautiful and still hostile. A poor room could be harsh and still comparatively warm. Status-shaped materials, yes, but not always the final sensation of the night against the skin. In winter, wealth had to work very hard to imitate what smallness and closeness gave more naturally. And that is one of the strangest, most human truths in this story. Sometimes the richest room was colder than the poorest one, not because the poor had discovered comfort, but because they had discovered concentration. And on a freezing night, concentration could feel a great deal like mercy. For all the cleverness of curtains, blankets, and shared warmth, the medieval night still had ways of getting in. It came through the window first, or rather through what counted as a window in much of the Middle Ages, a vulnerable opening in the wall, sometimes shuttered, sometimes covered, sometimes improved with cloth, horn, or small panes if a household was fortunate, but rarely sealed in any modern sense. These openings admitted light by day, but by night they reminded everyone that the boundary between inside and outside was far less secure than stone walls suggested. Wind searched for weakness patiently. It found the frame, the join, the warped edge, the unsteady latch, the hairline gap no one noticed until the room went cold enough for it to matter. That is why windows belonged to the nightly struggle as much as beds did. They were one of the places where the building confessed its limits.
A shutter could block the worst of the weather, but not all of it. Cloth stretched over an opening softened the air, but could not command it. Even where glass appeared, it was not necessarily thick, broad, or well-fitted enough to make a room comfortable by itself. And beyond the physical chill, there was something emotional in these openings too. The sound of them mattered. A loose shutter tapping in the wind, a faint whistle along the frame, the occasional rattle when weather turned rougher after midnight. These sounds made the cold feel active, almost intelligent,
as though the dark outdoors had not vanished at the wall, but was still trying the edges. You can imagine a sleeper hearing that from inside the bed curtains, not seeing the draft, but knowing exactly where it is, feeling it first as a narrow line across the face, then as a cooler patch near one shoulder, then as the reason a hand has slipped back beneath the blanket. Medieval comfort often failed not all at once, but by these thin intrusions. A room could be almost bearable until one line of moving air found skin. Then the whole body seemed to notice. So households fought back with layers and improvisation, shutters pulled tight, cloths added, gaps stuffed, hangings placed not only for beauty, but to interrupt the movement of air. Beds positioned away from exposed openings if the room allowed it. Every one of these acts was an admission that the room could not simply be trusted to hold itself together against winter. It needed help, daily help, seasonal help, human attention. And then there was the price of that defense, because once openings were closed as tightly as possible, once curtains were drawn and rooms made smaller and more enclosed, another reality thickened inside. Smoke, stale air, damp cloth, old straw, wool, human breath, animal presence, and all the smells of medieval domestic life gathering together under one roof. Warmth and freshness rarely arrived together. To keep out the wind was often to keep in everything else. This is one of the most important textures of the medieval night, and one modern imagination often cleans away too quickly. We are tempted to picture candlelight, woven blankets, carved beds, maybe a tasteful hint of wood smoke. But actual sleeping rooms and dwellings could smell dense with use. Smoke lived in fabric, damp lived in wool, rushes on the floor, however fresh they might once have been, trapped spills, scraps, moisture, and the small decays of household life. Bodies sweated under layers. Animals brought in fur, dirt, and breath. A room shut against winter did not become pure. It became inhabited more intensely. That inhabitation had its own kind of comfort, not always pleasant, but familiar. The smell of smoke in bedding meant the fire had been burning. The smell of wool meant blankets were holding against the cold. The mustiness of rushes and old straw meant the room was being used, crossed, slept in, lived in. Medieval people did not necessarily divide experience into clean and unclean the way we do now. They certainly noticed foul air and unpleasant smells. Many sources make that clear. Herbs were strewn, incense was burned, cloth was aired when possible. But people also accepted a range of physical intimacy with the materials of life that we are less used to. To smell the room was to know what had happened in it. The room told the truth through scent. A heavily smoked chamber told you how much the hearth had worked. Damp wool told you how much the building still resisted comfort. Animal smell told you that life and warmth were close by, whether in the same room or only just beyond a partition.
Even a fine room could not fully escape these layers. Wealth might add beeswax candles, better linen, stored herbs, perfumed oil, richer hangings, but it did not abolish the deeper atmosphere of medieval interior life. Fire still blackened the air. Winter still found the cloth. Breath still thickened in closed rooms by dawn. This is why staying warm was always a compromise rather than a victory. If you shut the room, you trapped smell. If you opened it, you admitted cold. If you built a larger fire, you risked more smoke and soot. If you reduced drafts with heavier fabrics, those fabrics absorbed the season back into themselves. Even the sensory signs of comfort carried costs. A warmed bed might smell of heated metal, smoke, old feathers, or wool beginning to steam slightly from trapped body heat. The room around it might be safer than outside,
but it was rarely fresh in a way we would call fresh now. And still, people chose warmth. Again and again, they chose it. That is perhaps one of the most revealing things of all. Given the choice between cleaner air and a colder room, many medieval households lived with the dirtier warmth. They coughed, aired things when weather allowed, used herbs, cleaned rushes, changed bedding where possible, but they did not mistake a cold, empty freshness for safety. Better a lived-in room than a freezing one. Better smoke than exposure. Better a dog at the foot of the bed and the smell that came with it than numb feet by dawn. You can feel the sensory density of such a night. The bed curtain carries wool and a trace of smoke. The blanket is warm in patches, cooler where the body has not yet reached. Somewhere beyond the bed, the room still holds old fire, damp wall, perhaps the faint sweetness of rosemary crushed into floor rushes days ago. The shutter gives a soft complaint in the wind. The air is not clean, exactly, but it is enclosed, and enclosure itself is part of what keeps the sleeper alive. That is the key, not perfection, containment. The medieval night indoors was not a triumph over winter. It was a managed pocket inside it, one held together by barriers that leaked, air that thickened, and choices no one would have made unless the season pressed hard enough to require them. Openings were weak, rooms absorbed life. Warmth had to be trapped with all the inconveniences that trapping implied. So, when we think of how people slept without freezing, we should imagine not only blankets and fire, but the whole enclosed atmosphere around them. The shutter closed against the wind, the room gone slightly stale, the smell of smoke absorbed into cloth, the damp kept mostly at bay, the body accepting these compromises because the alternative was colder, emptier, and more dangerous. The night always found a way in. People survived by deciding how much of it they could bear to keep out, and how much of indoor life they were willing to breathe instead. By the time a medieval person finally reached bed, the work of staying warm was not over. In some ways, it was only becoming quieter. The body itself had to be prepared. Clothing mattered. The timing of sleep mattered. Even the shape of the night mattered, because medieval rest was often less smooth and uninterrupted than modern people expect. Sleep came in layers, too, and winter had a way of breaking it apart. Most people did not go to bed naked. That would have made little sense in a cold room. Instead, they usually kept some barrier between skin and night air, a long shirt, a cap, wrappings at the feet, perhaps extra cloth around the shoulders,
perhaps more if the weather was severe or the household poor enough that undressing fully would have been foolish. Linen next to the skin made practical sense because it could be washed. Wool added more warmth when needed. Head coverings mattered more than they might seem. A cold head, cold ears, cold neck, these could make the whole body feel exposed. Medieval people knew that instinctively, even if they explained it through humors rather than thermodynamics. A sleeper was not simply getting ready for rest. A sleeper was being packaged against heat loss. That is why the gestures before bed would have felt so deliberate, removing only what could safely be removed, loosening what had to be loosened, keeping enough on the body that the bed did not have to do all the work alone. In a world without indoor climate control, the line between day clothing and night clothing remained practical rather than ceremonial. Sleepwear was not about luxury first. It was about making the body less vulnerable the moment it left the last fire. And then there was the problem of broken sleep. Winter nights were long, and medieval people often moved through them in segments. Not always, not everywhere in exactly the same way, but often enough that the pattern matters. A first sleep, then waking, then a second.
The waking could come from many reasons. The fire dying down, the need to relieve oneself, a child crying, a noise in the room, a draft suddenly noticeable, or simply the body reaching that natural interval in the deep middle of the night when consciousness returned for a while. In summer, this might have been merely a rhythm. In winter, it became a test. Because waking meant re-entering the cold. You can imagine how sharp that moment would feel. The blankets, after an hour or two, finally hold warmth. The body has stopped bracing. Then, suddenly, the sleeper wakes. Perhaps the embers have sunk too low. Perhaps a servant must rise and tend the chamber fire. Perhaps someone in a smaller house hears the hearth nearly dead and knows that if no one moves now, the room will be cruel by dawn. For a few seconds, there is the temptation to remain still and deny the problem. But cold has a way of forcing honesty. Someone must leave the bed. That journey from warmth back into open air may have been one of the least pleasant sensations in medieval domestic life. A hand emerges first, then an arm, then a foot onto the floor. Instantly, the body knows the mistake. The room seems colder than it had at bedtime because now there is something to compare it with. The blankets had created a little world, and stepping out of it feels like exile. The boards or rushes underfoot are hard. The air enters the sleeves and down the collar. Breath becomes visible again. Every movement toward the hearth or chamber pot or crying child feels longer than it should. This is one reason medieval sleep carried so much labor around it. Even in the middle of the night, warmth had to be maintained. Someone banked embers, someone added fuel, someone adjusted shutters, someone checked on infants, the elderly, or the sick, whose bodies could not tolerate as much cold. Someone pulled a blanket back over a child who had kicked it away. Someone noticed the dog had left the bed and the feet were colder for it.
Even a household at rest was not entirely at rest. Winter kept a small portion of human attention awake. The night was never fully abandoned to unconsciousness. It was managed in the dark. There is something very intimate in that. Not dramatic, not grand, but intimate. A mother, half awake, reaching to tuck in a child. A servant rising quietly so as not to wake a superior. An older man sitting by the embers for a minute longer than necessary because returning to a cold bed feels harder than facing the dim firelight. A monk or laborer
waking not because some philosophical clock has called him, but because cold and duty have entered the room together. And still, after all that, people lay down again. They found the warm hollow they had left. They gathered the covers back around themselves. They waited for the heat to rebuild in the little pocket around the body. Sleep, once broken, had to be negotiated into existence again. In this sense, winter rest was not a single descent, but several smaller descents, interrupted by cold, responsibility, and the practical demands of keeping life going until morning. That pattern tells us something important about medieval endurance. It was not only the ability to survive one hard moment, it was the ability to repeat the same small acts of protection over and over without imagining that they would ever become unnecessary. Rebuild the fire, rewrap the feet, pull up the blanket, return to bed, sleep again if you can, wake again if you must. This is also where the emotional tone of the medieval night becomes quieter and more human than any grand image of the Middle Ages usually allows. Empires, lords, monks, servants, peasants, travelers, all of them, in different ways, were subject to this simple truth. A winter night could break your sleep and ask something of your body before dawn. Not glory, not heroism, just effort. And effort in the cold has a way of making people gentle or irritable, patient or weary, honest about what matters.
By the middle of the night, rank mattered less than warmth regained. A person did not need a theory to understand this. The skin knew it. The lungs knew it. The aching feet knew it. Sleep itself became less a luxurious state than a repeated truce with discomfort. So when we picture a medieval sleeper, we should not imagine only the moment of lying down. We should imagine the whole cycle. The shirt kept on, the cap pulled low, the first deep sleep, the waking, the cold floor, the embers disturbed back to life, the blanket lifted and settled again, the body finding its warmth for the second time, the room slowly, reluctantly giving way to rest once more. Because this, too, was part of how people slept without freezing. Not by sleeping perfectly, but by learning how to return to warmth after the night kept taking pieces of it away. The people most at risk on a medieval winter night were not always the poorest, though poverty made everything harder. They were the bodies least able to defend themselves, the very young, the very old, the sick, the underfed, anyone whose strength had already been thinned before the night even began. Cold exposed weakness quickly. A healthy adult could shiver, curl inward, pull coverings close, and endure a bad room through stubbornness alone. But an infant could not manage blankets well. A fevered body could not regulate itself reliably. An old person whose blood moved more slowly, whose joints already ached, whose sleep had grown light and easily broken, entered winter with far less margin. For them, the same room, the same draft, the same drop in temperature could mean something more serious than discomfort. It could mean a long illness, a dangerous cough, confusion, pain, or simple exhaustion deepened over many nights until the body had too little left to offer. That is why care gathered most tightly around these people. Not always successfully. The medieval world was full of loss, but the effort was real. Children were often kept close for reasons that were as physical as they were emotional. The youngest might sleep near their mother or nurse. Small bodies were wrapped, swaddled, tucked between others,
placed where the household's warmth concentrated best. In a poorer room, that could mean close to the hearth, close to siblings, close to a wall less exposed to weather. In a wealthier setting, it might mean a carefully prepared bed, extra coverings, a warmer inner chamber, or a servant assigned to watch through part of the night. The methods differed. The instinct was the same. No one wanted a child left too alone with the cold. The old were treated with similar practical tenderness. An aging body often feels winter more deeply. Medieval people knew this without needing any modern medical language. They knew that some people took cold more easily, that certain bodies stiffened, weakened, or failed under weather that others endured. An elderly relative might be given the place nearest the fire in the evening, the smallest chamber in winter, the better blanket, the bed less exposed to drafts, the warmer side of a shared sleeping space. These were not gestures of sentiment alone. They were arrangements made in recognition of fragility. The sick, perhaps most of all, reveal how thin the line could be between care and survival. Illness made warmth matter even more. But illness also complicated it. A feverish person might burn and shiver at once. Thick coverings could comfort 1 hour and suffocate the next. Smoke from the hearth, necessary for warmth, could worsen coughing. Damp walls and stale air were hard on weak lungs, but opening the room too much brought cold back in. Medieval households had to manage these contradictions with whatever they possessed: warm drinks, hot stones, extra linen, prayers, herbs, attentive bodies nearby, someone waking through the night to notice if the sleeper had grown colder or stranger or too still.
This is where medieval sleep becomes not just a domestic question, but a moral one. Because who got the warmer place told the truth about a household. Who was moved inward from the draft? Who was tucked under the better coverlet? Who was not left alone? Who was checked on? Who was allowed the dog at the foot of the bed, or the heated stone, or the nearest place to the embers? Winter clarified priorities. Warmth was scarce enough that distributing it became a quiet expression of love, duty, rank, and fear. You can imagine the room very clearly. An infant breathing softly under layers. The mother waking almost at once if the breathing changes. An old woman insisting she is fine while her hands remain cold too long. A sick child restless in sleep, a basin nearby, a cloth warmed at the hearth and brought back again. An elderly man given the place nearest retained heat, his bones too stiff to recover easily from a harsh night. A household not truly asleep, because part of it is listening. Listening mattered. The medieval night was full of small sounds that could carry alarm, a different kind of cough, no movement where movement should be, a child whining in dreams, the weak call of someone who cannot get warm, the silence of a room gone wrong. In a world without thermometers, electricity, or central heat, the body was monitored through touch and sound. A forehead felt with the hand, feet checked beneath blankets, breath watched in candlelight or dawn gray, someone leaning close to decide whether a sleeper needs one more layer or less, more fire or cleaner air, more closeness or a little space. And behind all this sat a harder truth. Sometimes
care was not enough. The Middle Ages knew that well. Winter could turn a small sickness worse. A long, cold season could wear down the elderly even without one dramatic event. Children, especially infants, stood too near danger all the time. Food, warmth, immunity, rest, each depended on the others, and if one failed badly enough, the whole body could begin to fail with it.
Middle people did not need modern statistics to understand this. They knew from memory, from households that had buried someone too early, from neighbors who weakened after a bad winter, from the way fear entered a room when someone could not get warm. That fear did not make them passive. It made them attentive. And this attentiveness is one of the most moving parts of the story. Medieval life is often described through institutions, warfare, and power. But at night, the world became smaller and more human than that. A person bent over another person with a blanket. A hand at the foot of the bed checking for warmth. A nurse, mother, servant, daughter, brother, or wife, waking because someone vulnerable could not simply be left to the season. Much of winter survival happened in these almost invisible acts. Warmth was not always owned by the weak. Often, it was given to them. That is a different kind of history from the one monuments preserve, but it may tell us more about how people actually lived. Stone walls and rich fabrics mattered. Fire mattered. Architecture mattered. But when the body in danger was small, old, or unwell, what mattered just as much was whether another person noticed, whether someone gave up their place, whether someone stayed awake, whether someone understood that a long night asked more from the fragile than from the strong. So when we ask how people slept without freezing, we should also ask, who was helped to sleep, and by whom? Because the answer is not only technical, it is relational. The medieval night was survived not just by heavier blankets or better beds, but by households that knew some bodies had to be guarded more closely than others. The child, the old mother, the feverish servant, the weak infant, the coughing grandfather, the sleeper whose body could not negotiate with cold on equal terms. Winter made all of that visible, and by dawn, the success of a night was not measured only by who slept, but by who had been carried safely through it by the care of others. Which is why the final truth of medieval sleep is not simply that people endured. It is that they endured together, morning after morning, until light returned and the room revealed what the night had spared. By dawn, the truth of the night was impossible to hide. The fire had burned down to what remained of it. The room had settled into its coldest honesty. Whatever warmth the bed had managed to hold through the long hours was fragile now, already thinning at the edges, and the sleeper, half awake beneath heavy coverings, knew before moving that the worst moment of morning had arrived, the moment of leaving what little warmth had been built and stepping back into the room. This may have been the hardest moment of all, not because the night had failed, but because it had only just succeeded. The blankets were warm now in the places where the body had taught them to be warm. The hollow in the mattress held the memory of sleep. Breath had softened the little pocket inside the bed curtains. A dog at the feet, if there was one, had made itself part of that climate. A child beside you, a spouse, a sibling, another sleeping body under the same weight of cloth,
had helped hold the dark at bay. But the room beyond the bed had not changed much. The stone was still stone, the shutters were still cold, the water might still bite the hand like metal. Dawn did not cancel winter, it only exposed it more clearly. You can picture the first movement. A hand leaves the blanket and recoils from the air. A shoulder follows. The sleeper sits up and sees breath immediately. The curtain is pulled back. The floor waits, hard and unwelcoming. Somewhere, someone else in the household is already awake, stirring embers, carrying water, coughing in the gray light, crossing from one room to another with the stooped posture of a body not yet ready for the day. Morning does not feel fresh in the modern sense. It feels survived.
That, perhaps, is the most honest word for medieval winter sleep. Survived. Not because every night was a near-death drama. Most were not. People are adaptable, and repetition turns even difficult things into routine. But routine does not erase difficulty. It simply teaches the body how to live around it. By morning, what had happened through the night became visible in small ways. Stiff fingers, smoky cloth, condensation on stone, the stale smell of enclosed air, the relief of getting close to fire again, the quick, practical work of restoring the room to livability after hours of cold stillness. And yet there was something quietly beautiful in that morning, too, because dawn also revealed what had worked. The child is warm enough. The old woman made it through the night. The embers still hold enough life to catch when stirred. The bed did its job. The blankets did theirs. The dog stayed. The shutters held well enough. The household, through all its little acts of foresight and care, has carried itself another step through winter. No one may speak of this as triumph. It is too ordinary, too repeated, too woven into daily life. But it is a triumph nonetheless. The Middle Ages did not defeat cold. They learned how to live inside its reach. That is a subtler and, in some ways, more impressive achievement. Medieval people did not have a single answer to winter nights because winter itself was never a single problem. It was architecture, fuel, fabric, damp, hunger, status, fatigue, age, illness, and the vulnerability of the sleeping body all at once. So they answered it the only way human beings really can answer such things. With systems of care, accumulated habits, small material intelligence, and an endless willingness to do tomorrow morning what had to be done this morning. Warmth in that world was rarely abundant. It was made by drawing close to the evening fire before bed, made by choosing the right room in the right season, made by raising the bed above the floor and closing curtains around it, made by wool and fur and linen and tucked-in edges, made by sleeping near other bodies, made by carrying heat in the stomach from the last meal, made by waking to feed embers, made by noticing who in the household needed the better blanket, the warmer spot, the closer care. That is why the story of sleep in the Middle Ages ends not with a heroic trick, but with a human pattern. People stayed alive at night by refusing to rely on only one defense. They layered protection the way they layered cloth. One modest thing after another. A fire, but also a bed curtain. A blanket, but also a dog. A shutter, but also a cap. A smaller room. A fuller stomach. Another breathing body nearby. A servant who warms the bed. A mother who wakes at the slightest sound. A household that knows, from long practice, exactly how cold this room becomes by dawn, and exactly what must be done before dusk to answer it.
There is something deeply moving in that knowledge, not dramatic knowledge, domestic knowledge, bodily knowledge, the kind passed down without ceremony because survival depends on it. Which room is less cruel in January? Which wall sweats? Which blanket still holds its weight? Which child always kicks the cover free? Which elder must not be left near the draught? Which dog settles best at the feet? Which shutter has to be tied twice when the wind turns north? None of this is grand history, yet it is the texture of actual life, and without it, the grander history above it would never have rested long enough to continue. So when we imagine medieval nights now, it may be tempting to picture only discomfort. And the discomfort was real. But that is not the whole truth. Alongside the discomfort was ingenuity. Alongside hardship, care. Alongside cold stone, the patient human skill of making one corner of the world more livable than it ought to have been. That skill mattered in cottages and chambers,
In monasteries and manor houses, in the beds of the rich, and the shared coverings of the poor. It mattered because the body is fragile, winter is long, and sleep cannot wait for perfect conditions. It has to happen anyway. And so, night after night, people made it happen. They slept in a world that did not easily allow sleep. They built warmth where there was not enough of it. They trusted cloth, fire, nearness, memory, and each other. They woke in rooms that were still too cold, still smoky, still imperfect, and began again. If there is a single dignity at the center of all this, it is not grandeur. It is persistence, the quiet, repeated refusal to let the season have the final word. Now the morning light is thinning its way through the shutter. The room is beginning to reappear, the chair near the hearth, the rumpled blanket, the faint ash in the grate, the dark beam above, the worn floor waiting for footsteps. The bed has given what it could. The night is over. Somewhere in the house, life is starting again. And what remains with you is not only the cold, but the extraordinary human fact that people learned to sleep beside it. Not comfortably, not always, not without cost, well enough to endure, well enough to dream, well enough to rise again when the winter morning came.